Hello again, this is Mark Townsend and Maggy Whitehouse and the Train Wrecks for Jesus podcast. Thank you for coming along and listening to us again. And I want to start with a comment you made at the very beginning before we went on air, Mark, which was clergy wear is showing off. Discuss.
Well, just to put a bit of context to that, Maggie was just saying that some of the feedback we've had from our first podcast was that from one particular person, they didn't quite like the idea of us showing off in our clergy wear. I mean, I can't see what the problem is myself, but I just responded that surely it's showing off anyway, wearing vestments and things. It isn't really, we know that because it's about in persona Christi and stuff, but come on, I've been at theological college when the vestment companies come and seen all the guys tatting around with all their swanning around with it, even wearing purple shirts. Oh, I'll make a great bishop. Of course it's showing off.
Well, when I joined my church, the bishop had an assistant who said it's not a proper church if it doesn't have funny hats, which I thought was rather sweet.
Yeah.
It is showing off and it isn't. And I think it's one of the wonderful topics that we're always going to refer to, which is the yes and of things.
Yeah.
The holding together of what appears to be two opposing forces to try and create some kind of harmony between them, which I think is actually the original job of the clergy, would be to be able to say, let's make peace from this.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, I've got a friend who is ordained in Unity Church, which is the big American church started by Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, one of these positive thinking churches, but I work on their prayer line every week and they're really rather lovely. And she won't wear a clerical collar for two reasons. One, she's not Anglican or Catholic, and two, she doesn't want to set herself up as being something special.
Yeah.
And I heard her, but I also said to her, you also have to look at whether you're not willing to state in public your commitment to God. And she went, oh. And I think it is both. You can go around posing. My bishop says, somebody said about him, oh, he doesn't wear his clerical outfits, and I don't know why he doesn't wear his clerical outfits in public. I always wear my clerical outfits in public because it's really important that you show people who you are. And he just said, oh, he'll get over it.
Yeah.
And actually, if I could tell a story, which I thought rather funny, at my ordination, he lives in London and the ordination was in Birmingham, so my family could go. And obviously I did most of my training in Birmingham. And he came up and stayed overnight the night before with us because he was also quite well known to us. And my mum came round in the morning to bring some cakes and stuff for the tea afterwards. And he was outside in the garden. He just had a shower and he was outside in the garden having a cigarette in his PJs. And I introduced him to my mother. And as she came out again, she turned to me and said, not what I see as a proper bishop. That's not a proper bishop. And I was a little bit upset at the time because I was much younger than I am. And it was all a bit over emotional and a bit scary, the whole process. And I told my best friend who'd come round to support me that day exactly what she'd said. And unbeknownst to me, she told the bish. And I thought, I didn't think any more about it until the very end of the day when my mother quietly shook his hand and said, thank you very much, Your Grace. It was a beautiful service. And she had changed her mind. I knew that. And he just leant down slightly because he's a tall man and said, you're very welcome, Mrs. Whitehouse. What a shame we couldn't get a proper bishop.
Brilliant. Oh, lovely. Yeah. It's a funny old subject, isn't it? I when I was the vicar of the town that I'm sitting in now, Leominster, towards the end of my years, I stopped wearing the collar in the daytime because everybody knew who I was, and to me it's a signal, it's a sort of opening, a wonderful privileged opening into people's lives, isn't it? You know, you can literally knock on any door with a dog collar on, and at least it used to be the case. You'd be greeted and welcomed, and so in a sense it was it's like almost like a passport in a strange kind of way. But I stopped wearing it just because some of the negative connotations that come from clergy collars that we all know about. clergy abuse and things. And I for a while, I didn't want to be associated with that. But I've always valued vestments. That's a different matter altogether. I've always thought that, dressing up for worship is a beautiful thing. And in my even in my sort of years with the Druid people, they love the gowns for their rituals, and see it as kind of in no way sort of showing off, but just involving color and art and symbol, especially in what they do. I think a lot of the symbolism of clergy vestments has been lost over the years, and it looks like a sort of limelight on the person at the front, but of course it isn't. It's about somehow sanctifying and making holy and sacred and magisterial the whole act of worship, which to me is a wonderful, beautiful thing. But I guess it's one of those things, like you said, it's a double-sided thing. It can go either way, and we've all seen the pictures of the sort of the bishops who have a sort of 20-foot train and lace coming out of every orifice.
It is both. It is both. I've got some absolutely beautiful, magnificent vestments, and it's humbling to put them on.
Yeah.
Because you think, I'm not worthy of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do I dare go out in public wearing this exquisitely embroidered piece of tapestry and beauty? And I don't wear that one very often. I'll wear it for a religious wedding, but generally, if I'm doing a mass at home, a low mass, just me, I would usually just wear the white alb and a rope around my waist, and the rope for me signifies the humility of it, and the white signifies hopefully the purity of it, and it's important for me to do that. I agree with you, because before saying a mass I will wash my hands, and I will sit down for a little while and try and get myself into the zone, if you like, for doing the mass consciously. And I remember saying to a friend recently that if I'm doing a mass on my own, I do a slow mass, which means I do it really, really slowly. And she said, I can't think of anything more boring. And I know exactly what she means, but that's why I'll do a slow mass, because if I'm just going at the average speed, my mind can wander.
Yeah.
I can just not be involved with it. I'm not there. And I think it's really important that I am there.
Yeah.
Because if I'm not there at the moment when I invoke the angel of the presence, which is what I would call it, which is when the presence comes down at the sanctification. Well, if I'm not there, what's it going to do? I'm the grounding force. That's all I am. I'm just the grounding force for the flow. So to do a slow mass means I consider every line, and I often sit on the floor to do it, which is probably completely against every rule there is, and it makes it beautiful. It really does make it beautiful.
Lovely. That's triggered a thought, actually, that the idea of a slow mass, that's lovely. And something that happened today, which is going back to our idea for this book, which I think today I'll call an FAP rather than use the full word. I don't want to be accused of trivializing everything. But one of the things that I think sometimes we sort of I live in a dream world where you don't realize how absurd you're being until suddenly you see this, like a light turns on. And that happened to me this morning. I just got this new app, which is a crazy app, which I'm testing for a week. And it's basically a way of condensing a whole book, because all around me are piles of books, and I'll never read them all. I just keep getting books and books. But there's this app that basically condenses a book to about 20 minutes. That sounds like an awful idea, but I think it's for people to crash course in various subjects. You can even get Plato's Republic condensed down to sort of 20 minutes. So it's the basic points rammed into your head through audio, or you can read it. And it was hilarious, because this morning I looked up a book called The Miracle of Mindfulness by that wonderful Vietnamese Tay. Can't pronounce his name, so I won't. But the
one who died recently.
Yeah, recently. Yeah.
Yes, say it. Yes, let's call him that.
Let's call him Tay. But I was reading. I thought I'd read it rather than listen, and I just got into the introduction, and he was talking about the Buddhist monastery that he used to. He was a novice, and he had hundreds of plates to wash up every day, and they didn't have washing up liquid, just freezing cold water and rice and ashes to wash these plates. And he said in the modern monastery, they've now got scourers and washing up liquid, so it's much easier for the monks. And he was lamenting that what it's done to make life easier has stopped the process of washing being a process just to wash and just to get that all out of the way and get on to the next thing. And as I was reading this, I was scrolling down to see what's coming next. And it just occurred to me that I'm reading this book about mindfulness that's been condensed into 20 minutes to rush through it. And now I'm even rushing through that. I mean, what an absolute prick.
Oh, you know, how it's a valid point, isn't it?
You know, yeah.
We are getting this slow eroding of the attention span because of social media and this idea that you have to hurry up.
So it's just incredible. And thankfully I did wake up during the scrolling. I think, Mark, what are you doing? You shouldn't even have this book on this app anyway. I mean, it's such a contradiction. A book on mindfulness condensed out to 20 minutes so you can speed read it. And then even speed reading that. I mean, bloody hell. But that's how absurd for a major.
It does. It's a almost universal effort for all of us because we're speeding up. When I was first an online, no, I wasn't online. They didn't have the internet. A radio journalist. At the end of each afternoon, we had a half-hour program which summed up the news for the day, and the maximum of the recording for it was 3.5 minutes. Mm-hmm. And 3.5 minutes was a good meaty piece. I don't think anybody does 3.5 minutes now. They have to try and get it all into 1 minute.
Crazy.
Because our attention spans are sparking around all over the place. And I think that is actually one of the real reasons why we are ignoring nature so much, because we run around, and you could see the start of it. Oh, I saw the start of it about 25 years ago. I went on my first pilgrimage, and I don't mean to be rude to Americans. Americans, like the rest of us, are just people, but there was a certain tendency of the Americans on the coach. I mean, obviously we were going around Israel, and we weren't spending that long everywhere, but everywhere we went, there were 7 American women, and they got off the coach and ran into the gift shop. Because they could get more of an idea of the place they were going to through the gift shop than actually going to the place. And we were at Qumran, and they all ran off to the gift shop. This is going to sound really, really arrogant, but I don't think I got any money for the gift shop, actually. I spent all my money on the pilgrimage. But I went and stood by the view over where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And I was standing next to a really beautiful, wonderful woman. I still know her vaguely. She's the daughter of somebody very famous in the UK. So the story is ironic in a way, because we were just standing there looking out and trying to perceive what we could perceive. And she said to me, "There's a woman out there holding 2 scrolls. She's trying to attract our attention." And I thought she meant a real woman to start with, and she didn't. She was seeing something with her inner sight. And I was looking as well. And she turned to me and she said, "She's looking at you," and walked away.
Oh, right. Gosh.
And I stood there going, what? But I remained staying there. And the book of Deborah, was my first novel, came in an absolute download at that point.
Right. Gosh.
And at that point, I went back to the coach and scribbled down half the first chapter before I did anything else. And the irony of it was, I don't think I was the first choice, Mark. I think she was. Point of it was, if she had received that download and written that book, which she was entirely capable of doing, that book would have become a bestseller because of her name.
Right. Gosh.
And I was number 2.
Wow.
And I don't mind that, because I wrote a
Yeah.
good book and it's still published and people still write it. And I
Mm.
put an awful lot of my own pain with my relationship with Jesus into it. It's actually the autobiography of a female cousin of Jesus who's raised in the Holy Family. So I was able to
Right.
bring a lot of my pain into it. But she'd had a lot of pain in her life too. It would have been
Yeah.
a different book, but just as good or maybe even better. And I'm not quite sure what the point of that is, but in that case, she at that point was the F up. She walked away. I'm
Yeah.
quite
Yeah.
sure it was her
Yeah.
book.
Yeah. Wow. Amazing.
I don't know how
Yeah.
we got round to that,
Incredible.
but anyway. Oh yes, it was all the Americans running off to the shop, but the two women who
Oh,
didn't
yeah.
run to the shop got a download.
Yeah. Incredible. Wow. So when did you go to the Holy Land? When was that?
It was about 1994, I think. The book came out
Right.
in
Right.
96.
Ah.
And that was one of those things that makes you think that your life is going to flow in a certain wonderful direction, because the book came, I wrote it, an agent appeared out of the blue.
Mm.
The guy who ran the publishing part of Little Brown
Mm.
accepted it, loved it, published it. And I thought, oh, I'm going to be a successful writer. And do you know, in the
Wow.
very same week, The Red Tent came out by Anita
Oh,
Downs.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
And there was a choice. Did they put $250,000 into advertising my book or her book?
Oh,
And they chose
really?
her book.
Gosh. Oh, boy. Yeah. Amazing. Oh, Israel changed my direction as well, actually.
Did it? Tell me about it, please.
Yeah. I remember I was how old? I was about 19, I think, and I went over. At that stage, I was Pentecostal and about to go off to become a pastor of a Pentecostal church. Yet I was having huge doubts about sort of scripture and whether we really could see it as a word of God and inerrant and all that sort of stuff. I wasn't getting any decent answers from my church, so I thought I'm just going to get away, and I went away for 4 months. I gave up my job and I just I went to the Israeli embassy on my own in London, and it was all quite scary really for a young lad. Ended up going to a kibbutz on the north border of Israel. Stayed for about 4 months, but I also did a lot of traveling. I stayed in Jerusalem for 2 weeks and down to Tel Aviv and all sorts. Sorry, up to Eilat and other places. But in Jerusalem, it took 3 attempts to get to Bethlehem, and I finally got there because there were a lot of strikes on. It was quite a tense period, and I got to the Church of the Nativity, and this is as a Pentecostal who sort of thought such places were quite idolatrous,
Mm-hmm.
Went in through the tiny little door and went down into the grotto,
Mm-hmm.
where tradition says X marks the spot where Jesus was born. And I was just totally blown away because I sat down in this beautiful candlelit, again, for me as a Pentecostal, something that isn't really right, that's not how you worship God, but a candlelit grotto with incense in the air and lamps everywhere, and a constant stream of people from different nationalities, some speaking in tongues, some speaking in their own languages, kneeling down and kissing this place where they believed Christ was born. And it was like a continuation of the wise men. It's like people from all over the earth coming. That's what it felt like symbolically, and just plugging into this essence of the incarnation. And that changed me completely. I knew at that point I had to have more of this. I had to, so I came back to England and obviously couldn't continue as a Pentecostal. I ended up an Anglican, and then gradually, as I say, climbed the candle up to the high church part of Anglicanism, and where I could sort of find again some of that tradition and that beauty, and that's where I guess I still am. But yeah, so Israel had quite an impact in that way on me as well. I expected the to be bowled over by the more sort of natural places, and they were powerful, Sea of Galilee and other areas. But I was really stirred by the ancient religious buildings. I
That's a
found them
really
super
lovely
powerful.
story. That's
It's
beautiful. Yes. Well, when we went to Israel, I made a decision not to take my camera.
Oh, right. Yeah.
because we'd been on a holiday the year before where we went whale watching,
Mm-hmm.
and I never saw a whale. I've got lots of pictures of whales,
Mm.
but I wasn't present.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And I really wanted to be present for Israel. Have I told you my Western Wall story?
No. No.
Oh, may I?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yes, it was an extraordinary visit, because I think what you're talking about is, even though whatever we believe happened there, even if it didn't happen, we've created archetypes.
Yeah.
And you walked in the place where Christ was born. It doesn't matter whether Christ was born. It doesn't matter whether Christ was born at all. It doesn't matter if Jesus even existed. The archetype now does.
Mm.
And the archetype is beautiful.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
hopefully for most people, it's beautiful. Okay, so we went to Israel with a Jewish group.
Yeah.
I was married to a Jewish man at the time, and at the time, says the vicar who's divorced. Oh, the shame. And I was still nominally a Christian, even though I'd sort of thrown an awful lot of it out. And I was really happy in this Jewish family. I was finding it incredibly helpful and useful to understand the background of Jesus, if you know, how he learned and what laws he would have worked with, and understanding it. So we went to Israel, and because it was a Jewish group, we were going to all the Jewish synagogues and the places that honored the great rabbis of the past. We weren't going to Nazareth. We were going to go to Jerusalem, but we weren't going to any of the holy places for Christianity. I broke away for a couple of times. And because it was Jewish, there was segregation at all the synagogues and all the sacred places. So the men went off to the left and the women went off to the right. And the leader of the group was male. So all the women started grumbling. And you know the word susurration. I love it. It's sort of
Yeah.
And the more we broke off into two sides, and the women's sides of the synagogues, I have to say, there was an awful lot of renovation and grubbiness in them. I don't know if it was the same the men's side, but the women were going, "It's not fair, it's not fair, it's not fair, it's not fair." They're getting all these inspirations, they're getting this, that, and the other. And I was sort of going, well, why don't we do something? But I didn't dare, because I was nominally a Christian. I was new to this group, this philosophy group, and I just didn't dare. So we went on day after day with the women going grumble, grumble, grumble. Then we went to the Western Wall, and the men were all praying together, and the women was again going, me. And I thought, well, what if I got them in a circle? And I didn't dare. We went back to the hotel, and I started feeling ill, which was really weird, because I'm solid as a rock usually, and I didn't want my supper, which for me was phenomenal. So I went up to the room and got into the bath, which is always my place of utter repose. And I just got this voice in my head. I'm not clairsentient or clairvoyant, but I am quite clairaudient sometimes. The messages come through to me in words. And it was just quite simple. Why didn't you speak, Maggie? And I said, because I'm not good enough. And there was this kind of sigh. And then I will always remember these words to the day I die. I said, you know what, Maggie? You're absolutely right. You're not good enough. You'll probably never be good enough. But you were the only one who was listening. And we must work with those who listen. And that was as revelatory for me as what you've just described there. It was one of those seminal moments of life, which is you don't have to be good enough. You start the work now. And
Lovely.
I was
beautiful.
in a bath in a cheap hotel. And I said, oh, and they said, next time, will you speak? Will you promise? And I thought, well, that's okay. We're not going back to the Western Wall. We're off to Qumran tomorrow. And I said, yes, I promise. And I've learned ever since never to make promises. And the next morning, I felt well after that. Next morning, we got up. We were supposed to go to the Dome of the Rock, and then we were going to Qumran. We went to the Dome of the Rock, and the door was shut. And they said it would not be open for another half hour because of some reason inside. So the leader of our group said, well, that's all right. We'll go back down to the Western Wall for half an hour. And all the way back to the Western Wall, I have to admit, Mark, I was going, you bastard, you bastard, you bastard, you bastard. And we got to the Western Wall, and I'd made a promise, and I had to. So I just said quietly to the women, why don't we get into a circle and pray together? Why don't we get into a circle and pray together? And you know, Mark, that was all I had to do. I didn't have to lead the prayers, and it's a jolly good thing I didn't try to lead the prayers, because as soon as we got into a circle and held hands, Spirit came and the other women started speaking.
Yeah.
And 25 years later, I was on another tour with this group, and the leader, who was looking back over the life of this particular group, was saying, let's talk about the highlights of what you've experienced. And one of the women stood up and said, the highlight for me was 25 years ago when the women at the Western Wall spontaneously got into a circle together and started to pray. And it was just such an affirmation. It didn't need my ego in there for anyone to say, oh, it was Maggie that did it. It didn't need that.
Yeah.
By telling the story, I'm risking people saying, yes, but she's telling the story that it was her now. But I'm trying not to do it that way, as in it was the movement of Spirit through just the person who was listening. And I actually think that's relevant for our book, The Train Wrecks for Jesus, because I am a train wreck. I was a train wreck. And back then I was so scared I wouldn't speak up. But the message was, we can only work with those who listen.
Yeah. Beautiful. That's a perfect story for the book, isn't it? It relates so well.
I hope
I
so.
mean, absolutely. I mean, I've always felt not enough, you know, and I know so many people who are the same, and there are various sort of psychological explanations for this, and it doesn't really matter why, but so many of us just feel not enough, particularly people in religions, it seems. This sort of and it's very strange, going back to that idea of a Pentecostal sort of tradition, which in its own way has a lot of beauty and magic about it. I couldn't remain there because my mind doesn't cope with being told what to believe, and it's hyper fundamentalist. But even in that tradition, coming in with this kind of, you know, God loves you and died for you sort of thing, and the sort of rush of emotion that you get, and this idea of you being worth so much to God that he did this for you. It's so, you know, you soon find out that there are kind of catches, you know, there's a whole lot of payment involved, and the payment in terms of how you now need to live, and how you now need to read your Bible every day, and how you now need to stop saying that or thinking that or looking at that, and it soon becomes a meritocracy, and it's like the grace is totally lost.
Yes.
And that's probably true in every different tradition. I mean, that's the one that I came into it through, and it's not that I don't think anybody deliberately does it, and probably a lot of it is just in our own heads anyway. I mean, I have this critic sitting on my shoulder, which is never not there. And I guess I've learned to listen to the other voices a bit more, but it's still there. It was even there this morning as I was driving my car to a funeral. You know, it's like a ha ha ha, we're going to get you sort of horrible, ogresome voice. And I have learned to, you know, and the voice that puts us down, the sort of the policeman on the shoulder, or the sort of old-fashioned teacher who's ready to beat you if you do this wrong, and it's all of that stuff that I think inspires me to continue with this idea of the train wrecks book, because I'm sure that so many people are in that place. And but even, I mean, I think the lovely thing about writing a book, and we both know this, it's like you talking to yourself, isn't it? You kind of, you sit there with a blank page, and something happens that you start kind of listening, and then you have this sort of dialogue with yourself, and you start oh, the doors, nope. I thought someone was good, but you sort of become your own teacher, and I love that. But then even then the criticism comes in, and the judgments, and so it's and I don't think we ever kind of become enlightened, you know, whether it's sort of Eastern enlightenment or Western salvation, you know, the idea that you sort of get it all in one moment, and the sort of the sort of classic conversion of, you know, give your life to Jesus and everything's it's never like that. It's a process, and it's a 2 steps forward, 1 step back all the way.
Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 6 steps back. But yes, I hear you.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, and falling into a bloody big hole and stuck there. But that's all part of the story, isn't it?
It is. You're talking about what the Hebrews call the Yetzertov and the Yetzerhara, which is you have a little angel on one shoulder and a little demon on the other.
Oh, right.
Listen to at which point, and I think it's the Yetzirah that's the demon, and that's the one that tells you you're no good, you're not good enough, you're going to mess this up, you're going to screw it up, and we tend to believe it because we've also been taught that by our peers and our parents and other people.
Yeah.
Sorry about background noise. It's a beagle.
Oh. Ah.
There's always a beagle. I want both of us. We both love the Prodigal Son parable, don't we?
Yes.
Because we are the prodigal son, both of us are the prodigal son. And I was talking to Bish. I do call him the Bish. He doesn't know I call him the Bish. If he ever listens to this, I'll be in big trouble. I was having my regular meeting with him to make quite sure I wasn't a complete train wreck and wasn't going completely in the wrong direction, just marginally. And he was talking about Kyrie eleison. In the Mass, it's Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison. If you do that little bit in the it's actually Greek. It's not Latin, which is interesting. And he said, eleison, if you look at the meaning of it, we translate it as Lord have mercy or Christ have mercy. But like Hebrew, I'm going to have to throw something at the dog because she's chewing her ass. It is distracting me. Stop being a train wreck for Jesus. Anyway, the Hebrew and Old Testament Greek, New Testament Greek, sorry, and the Septuagint is also Old Testament Greek, is pictorial. The word, you can't translate word for word.
Right.
And it's the same with many, many languages. You can't translate. So it doesn't actually mean mercy. It actually means more that the second you turn back, the second you surrender or give up, it's not that God will graciously accept you back into the fold. It's that God starts running towards you.
Wow.
The second you open that door. And he said, you look at the prodigal son, the father is practically standing on the roof looking for his child, waiting for that moment the child actually comes to his senses and say, I would rather serve in my father's house than rule anywhere else. And at that moment, the second you go, I might be a screw up. God comes flowing, racing, running towards you to embrace you. It's not about your going back saying, I am a poor, I'm not worthy to pick up the crumbs under your table, which always used to hack me off in communion as a kid, actually. Even though I knew I wasn't worthy, I hated being told I wasn't worthy. Because I went back to that story of Jesus and the Syro-Phoenician woman where she says, Lord, even the dogs can pick up the crumbs under your table. And Jesus goes, oh gosh, yes, actually, you just taught me something there. But this idea that the second you drop your defenses, and I was doing this in meditation this morning because I was thinking, I haven't got much time here. I've not got the full length of time I want to do to contact the divine, to get into this. And again, the feeling just came through and said, Maggie, your only job right now is to start lowering your defenses because I'm already here. I'm always here. Lower the barriers.
Brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. That is the gospel in a nutshell, that parable. And one of my ex-pastoral tutors, a lovely old chap, a monk, he's no longer with us, but he said, if you take away every other part of the Bible, not that we should, not that we want to, but if you could, and we're just left with that parable of the loss of the prodigal son, we would still have the gospel. And some people, when they hear that, say, no, you haven't got the cross in that, or the resurrection. Of course you have. The cross is in the Father longing to see his son come back. Costly love. That's what the cross symbolizes. And the resurrection, of course, is the embrace. And it's a beautiful story. And,
and on the, sorry, I'm interrupting you.
No, go on.
Also trying to manage 2 beagles. But it is on the cross because when in the mystical tradition, we look at the four Gospels as different levels of comprehension, and Luke, being the spiritual Gospel, is the one in which Jesus is talking beyond the crowd. He's talking to people beyond the tribe. It's the Gospel of the women, 19 stories of the women, as opposed to 4 or 5 in the others. And it's in Luke that Jesus says, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing.
Right.
And at that point, resurrection is a done deal, because he's let go. The 2 earlier Gospels, Matthew and Mark, he's going, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is exactly what we do when we're hurting.
Yeah.
But when the story of the Gospel of Luke is he manages to let go. It's not, why have you forsaken me, God? It's actually, forgive them. They really don't know what they're doing to me. And the mystical teaching is that that's the moment that God flows down and it's all over and resurrection is beginning.
Beautiful. Is there a Gospel of the Prodigal Beagle? You got 2 there, so which one of them? One of them must be the good one, the other the naughty one.
You know, one of the times I allowed myself to be scuppered was I came up with an idea for a picture book called Jonathan Livingston Beagle.
Oh, brilliant.
And I thought it was brilliant. I started writing it, and I went round for tea with a friend of mine who was married to a guy who was quite high up in the holistic world and still is. And I was telling her excitedly about this idea, and he turned around and said, I think you'll find that contradicts copyright, and that the author of Jonathan Livingston Seagull would seriously object to that. And I never wrote it.
Well, that's a shame. I can't see why.
No, but that was my inner saboteur making his opinion far more important than mine.
Yeah. Oh,
so maybe I've got to write that book.
I think you have, because that's brilliant.
It was all about a beagle that just got its own way manipulatively, really. But like...
No, wonderful. Oh, excellent. Yeah. In the in a retreat that, and again, now I don't want to sound arrogant, because I think it's a crazy idea that I ever ran a retreat, but I did once, and who the hell would come to a retreat run by me? But I did. And one of the things I used to get people to do at the end, it was a Gospel Falling Down retreat, was to play the part, get volunteers to play the part of the 2 sons. And I wrote the story of the Prodigal Son as a dialogue between 2 sons, and then the father at the end, who's also the mother, really. I don't know if you've seen Rembrandt's picture of the painting of the Prodigal Son. Yeah, beautiful. So he's got one feminine hand and one masculine hand. So it's definitely a father, mother, God. But and that was really interesting, because it sort of it helped, I think, people to recognize that we have these 2 sons or 2 daughters in our own psyches. We have the perfectionist and the rebel, and both needed really to let down their defenses, and one did by being reckless, the other never did. And it's still in that kind of or at the end of the story, poor lad is still in that position where he's living within grace but can't quite see it.
Yeah, I was like that growing up. I didn't like the parable when I was a child, because I was the good child. I was codependent to my mother, who had mental health issues in a time when mental health issues really weren't recognized. She did amazingly well, but I covered up for her so much, and I used to hear that and think, I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair that the fatted calf was brought out for the prodigal. And that comes back to Jesus's parable about the hiring of the workmen for the fields, isn't it? And how the ones that come for the last hour are paid as much as the ones at the beginning. That's Jesus's message, one of the great messages that we don't understand, which is, you come home, it doesn't matter at what stage, at what point, you are always welcome.
Yeah. And in that sense, it isn't fair, because it isn't a meritocracy. It isn't about what you deserve.
No.
And there's another version of the Prodigal Son, which is an amazing story of. If you're aware of Trevor Dennis,
no,
he's last time I knew of him, he was Dean of Chester Cathedral. He's a wonderful storyteller, Old Testament, so you'd love him. But he also rewrites some of the parables, and he rewrote the gospel of the parable of the Prodigal Son, in a modern contemporary sort of context. But what was brilliant, but awful about his story is at the very end when the son comes running back, because he isn't repentant. He's just saying, I can get more out of my dad if I go back and put on a sob story. You know, there's no real sign of genuine, that the breaking of the heart comes after he's embraced by his dad. But in this story, he comes running back, and the dad is there standing, running towards him, as you say. And the boy comes and pushes him over, tramples over him, and goes and takes more money and runs off again. And it's horrific, but he's saying, you know, it's still that could happen, and he would still love his son. And I mean, it's like, oh my God, you know, it's like, and that's again what similar to what we were talking about earlier, or maybe a few days ago, in this idea of sort of license to be bad, which we're not saying in our book. You know, it's not a license to be bad, but that's kind of pushing that to the extreme. You know, what if he did do that? And the only answer is that the dad would carry on forgiving him.
The dad would carry on forgiving him, but from the Garden of Eden, we know that there are consequences.
Yeah.
God will always love you. You don't have to turn back to God for God to love you. God's love is. But we can't receive it until we surrender to it. But it's always there.
Yeah, the symbol of the lad living, feeding the pigs and scratching his sores, that's the consequence. His dad is still sending unconditional love towards him, but he's living in a place where he can't feel it or receive it. So it's a strange kind of, I think this is where people get a little bit confused by the whole grace thing. And I know some people say, oh, confession's terrible because it just means you can go and do it all over again. Well, in a sense, yes, it does, but that isn't really a true, it isn't a true breaking of the heart if that's what your intention is, just to go and, oh, let's go and top up on the grace and go off and bugger about again. You know, it's not. I know from even that little tiny glimmer of light this morning when I saw what a useless idiot I was being by racing through that wonderful Buddhist writing, and then the light came on. It's so shocking, even that tiny, almost insignificant little symbol of that, or you know, type of that. It's not about then going off and, you know, it would have been ridiculous if I'd have then gone back to switch on that thing and listen to the rest of the book at you know, rate of knots, because I wouldn't have learned anything. And I didn't do that, thankfully. I chose a different book instead. I listened on the way to my funeral today. I listened to, wait for this, I listened to The Brief Theory of Everything, from Leinster to Ledbury. So it was a sort of 12,000 page book. By the time I got there, I'd had the brief history of everything rammed into my head. I don't know what the hell I learned, but so in a sense, I am still in that place. But I wasn't going to do it with the Buddhist book. I shall buy the book properly and savor every sentence.
I understand that I can speed read. I'm dyslexic, so I see the picture in a paragraph.
Yeah.
I see the whole thing in a picture and then move to the next paragraph, which means it's possible for me to scan a book incredibly quickly, but you're right, we don't get into it. I'm currently reading The Law of Three by Cynthia Bourgeault. She's an American teacher of mystical Christianity, and it's too hard for me. But I know I've got to read it because I've committed to teaching the Law of Three in the Kabbalah group that I teach. So I've set myself up deliberately with a book, and I have to read every page 3 times to even understand it. Of course, I'm avoiding reading it, but I know I've got to. So sometimes you just have to set yourself those disciplines to make sure you do the work.
Yeah. Oh boy.
I've also learned something, which is that I still tend to interrupt people. So I apologize, Mark. I've interrupted you twice at least.
I don't think you have you? Have you?
I think so. Anyway, sorry, and I'll try not to.
No, not at all.
I think we've come to the end of our time.
I think we have. We've been talking for 45, 50 minutes. So yeah, lovely.
Lovely. here we are then. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, if you did listen. And if you sped through it, well, hey, we're train wrecks like you are, so we forgive you, as if you needed forgiving.
And if people do listen, is there any way that they can comment?
Yes, on YouTube, absolutely, yeah.
Excellent. So, suggestions for things that you'd like to hear two old train wrecks talk about.
Old train. you actually crumble your sound a bit like it sounds like two old fucking wrecks.
That as well.
Yes, we're on Podbean, we're on YouTube, and I'm going to get my techie hat on and sweat a lot and try and get us up on Apple Music and things like that as well. So,
Brilliant.
So
Wonderful.
We'll see you everybody next time, or we'll hear you everybody. Oh, never mind. Thank you for listening.
Cheers.